All right, so next up we have Ryan Hayden. He's with the Ohio State University Agroecosystem Management Program. Unfortunately, I think Marilla Chivagato was sick today. She was unable to join. So the title's a little bit different as you see on the screen, and I'll turn it over to Ryan. Thank you for being here.
All right, everybody, can you hear me okay? All right, well, thanks for coming out today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor of soils and agronomy based at the Agricultural Technical Institute in Worcester. So if you have kids, send them our way. I always put a little plug in there for ATI. But this is an exciting project for me. This project is basically designed to take a look at some of the environmental and economic trade-offs, benefits and trade-offs associated with integrating livestock into cash grain cropping systems. And we've got a really broad team of scientists and students and extension folks that are contributing to this, as well as many, many farmers. And so I'll just that list of names is mostly the Ohio State contingent, but there's a much longer list of farmers that have contributed to this. And so I want to just recognize their contribution. All right, well, is there... Okay, well, this is not gonna... Yeah, see if we can get our clicker going. Perfect. All right. So the premise of this project was basically to take a look at the question of specialization of farm operations versus the integration of livestock. So if you look back at agricultural history, we're definitely seeing trends that are likely to continue in terms of specialization. And there's a lot of good reasons for this in terms of higher production efficiencies and yield, ease of management. But at the same time, we're also seeing a lot of unintended consequences and side effects. And some of those involve shorter, simpler rotations, increased reliance on purchased inputs with subsequent exposure to fluctuating fertilizer markets and commodity markets. And we've also seen issues related to not having enough acres to spread livestock manure for some. And then the flip side of that, as certain farmers having limited access to the manure that could potentially benefit their farms. And then this has resulted in a range of impacts on soil health that we're going to take a look at today, and potential losses of nutrients to air and water and climate, with all of the regulatory considerations and concerns that that we all face. So what this project is really designed to do is to ask the question, what are the opportunities and barriers to future integration of crops and livestock if growers choose to go that route? So a couple of other goals of this project are to leverage history. So we're looking at farmers who have managed their fields in particular ways over an extended period of time, typically 5 years. And we're going to be interested in tracking some of the outcomes of those management practices on those fields in 31 working farms, total of 86 fields. And we're then working with farmers to interpret those results. So this week, we've already had 2 rounds of farmer meetings with our farmers throughout the state, and we're asking questions. What are the pros and cons of different management strategies? What kinds of evidence or information are they using to determine the evolution of their farm operations? And then we're also using this information to ground truth some of the modeling platforms that are being used to help guide decision making and policy making at a large scale. So while the modeling framework that we're looking at is mostly economic and to a certain extent environmental, it's not, some of the same carbon, modeling frameworks that maybe have been discussed so far. Now, the areas that we're looking at in this project, we wanted to capture farms located across a diverse cross-section of soils. And so we have farms based around Worcester, Wayne, Holmes, Stark, and Medina counties. And then in Western Ohio, in Mercer, Dark, Shelby, and Auglaize counties as well. And the farm types that we were working to capture is farms that might have had a focus on cash grain production, livestock operations that have integrated, farm production methods, and then livestock-only operations. And in particular, just for the sake of this project, we focused in on cattle, both dairy and beef animals, because we wanted to kind of narrow the signal related to the manure from those ruminants. And not to say that there's not a lot of other potential soil health benefits for other classes of livestock, but for this study, we made that decision. Now, when we were selecting fields and farms to include in this study, we basically had 4 bins that we, were looking to, characterize. So we had class 1 fields, which were cash grain only with no manure. Typically, these were corn, soybean rotation. Occasionally, they might have had a little bit of wheat, potentially some cover crop in there, but they had no imported manure and generally no perennials. So they didn't have extended rotations with like alfalfa or anything like that in. Our class 2 fields were similar to class 1 with the exception that they were importing manure, generally from off the farm. And that was kind of tough to find in many respects, but we found a number of examples of that. But again, those cash grain focused operations with the essential substitution of commercial fertilizer for manure. Not entirely, but in part. And then our 3rd and 4th classes, class 3 involved fields that had more diversified rotations. Oftentimes, these might have been dairy operations or beef operations. So they had livestock on the farm. They had more extended rotations that allowed them to grow forage, often alfalfa in them. They had manure that they could distribute themselves. And so this was kind of our class 3. And then class 4 were pure perennial crops. So these were permanent hay fields and pastures. No corn, soy, or wheat. And in general, manure was applied either through spreading or direct deposition by the animal themselves. And so across those 4 categories, we tried to find fields that reflected those managements. So we would meet with farmers, interview them, find out if their management fit one of those 4 field classes. And our goal here wasn't to ask them to do anything different, but just to continue farming the way they've been managing in the recent past. And they had to be in those 4 bins for a minimum of 5 years. Many times it was much longer. And total of 31 farms and 86 fields. So thing to keep in mind with this type of study is very different than a controlled field experiment. I do a lot of those throughout my career, and there's value to those. But one of the drawbacks to those controlled field experiments is they don't really fully reflect what's happening on the farm. And so in this study, we had to use a different approach. So instead of an experiment, this is more a descriptive, assessment. So we're looking at their management practices. We're collecting information on those management practices and the economics of their operation, what tillage practices and cover cropping practices they're using. And then we can do a multivariate analysis based on a fairly sizable population of fields that we're drawing from. And we captured a lot of information. We measured soil health parameters in both years on all the fields. We also clipped forage samples and crop samples to look at nutrient dynamics and carbon across all crops, grain crops, hays and pastures, cover crops. We sampled feed and manure to get us understanding of the nutrient balance. And we also, on 4 intensive farms, measured greenhouse gases and nitrate and phosphate in groundwater. I'm not going to present that information today. I want to focus primarily on the soil health parameters, as that's kind of been my component of this project. So just to take a step back, my understanding when I approach the question of soil health, I see soil health as looking at the ability of a soil to perform its needed functions within an agroecosystem. So those functions can be crop production, they could be nutrient retention and availability, they can be related to environmental losses, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions or water. And so when we evaluate the health of a soil, I think it's really important to hit a broad cross-section of the physical, chemical, and biological indicators of soil health, and then look at them over time in relation to different management practices. And it's also important to recognize that when we think about different soil health indicators, we've got certain indicators that are inherent. They might be inherent to the soil properties, the texture, the clay mineralogy of a site. And these are largely, not possible to change very readily. They're relatively fixed. And then we've got our dynamic indicators that respond to management. So I'm going to primarily focus on those dynamic indicators today, and largely the biological indicators, because those are some of the indicators which there's a lot of really active and exciting research going on in the community of scientists, and there's growing interest among farmers. And that's actually what really attracted a lot of our farmers to this project, was the opportunity to learn more about the soil biology on their farms. And that's what you'll kind of see here today. So to start with, I'll start with an example of our physical health characteristics. And aggregate stability is a really interesting variable. We basically subject soil aggregates to a dunking, procedure, and see how those soil aggregates withstand that disturbance event. And one of the things that we very clearly saw is a an increase in aggregate stability as you moved from, cash grain only, cash grain with manure, more diversified rotations with manure, and then later the perennial crops. And this is, these are the kinds of trends that we maybe hypothesized that we might see, but we weren't sure until we actually tested that out in the field. And I will take a moment to kind of help you unpack how we're displaying this soil health data. So along our vertical axis is typically the indicator value. The horizontal axis is our 3 different field class categories. And that dark line that runs through the middle of each box, these are called box plots or box and whisker diagrams. That center line is our median. So if you have, say, 11 samples that you're measuring, that's the 6th sample in order. And then we've also got those whiskers, which represent our range, which captures 90% of all the samples. And then the box is kind of where the center 50% of samples, reside. So we're going to use this sort of structure to look at the data across our different soil health parameters. So next one is a metric that hopefully you guys are familiar with, the Mehlich-3 phosphorus test. It's a good benchmark for fertility. And when we're looking across these different field class categories, a couple of interesting things to note in the context of soil health. And when I think of soil fertility, I'm looking for fertility levels that are within the expected, productive range for meeting our crop needs, but also not going much beyond the upper maintenance limit. So if you look at our cash grain with no manure and with manure, you'll notice that the mean is maybe just a touch under 40 parts per million for Mehlich-3, which is actually where it needs to be for your corn and soybeans. Interestingly enough, we see it bumped up a little bit, just under 50 for our more diversified rotations, which actually is pretty close to the upper maintenance limit for alfalfa. And alfalfa is very common in those rotations. Now, you'll notice that the boxes, the upper end of the box sometimes goes up above that threshold. And we have some outliers there that, those individual growers may want to take special note of where their phosphorus levels are and potential water quality risks. But, that's real world data. I've seen plenty of farms with much higher Mehlich-3 phosphorus levels on certain fields. So what I'd like to focus mostly on, though, today is the biological health indicators. These are largely derived from your soil organic matter, and in particular, the various pools of soil organic matter that you might have. So you've got a large pool of soil organic matter that we see as fairly stable and passive, not readily decomposed. Then you've got your slowly decomposing organic matter and your active carbon fraction, which is a measure of soil organic matter that is readily decomposed by soil microbes and potentially responsive to management. And so most of you guys are familiar with organic matter on your own soil tests. This is basically a loss on ignition sort of test where you stick it in an oven, you burn away that organic matter, and then you look at the difference in weight. Active carbon is a more recent soil health measure that, like I said before, is pretty responsive to management. So we included that. We also look at soil respiration as a measure of microbial activity, and they're respiring CO2. So we're measuring that carbon dioxide. We're also looking at soil proteins as an indicator or measure of organically bound nitrogen. And then we're also looking at certain soil enzymes, and these are enzymes that are released by soil microbes to catalyze decomposition. So those microbes are not eating things, but they are decomposing things and then absorbing the nutrients or energy that they require. So let's start with soil organic matter. And not surprisingly, as you move from a cash grain operation with no manure to adding manure, we see a small bump in organic matter, and then a larger bump when we diversify our rotations and add manure, and then an additional increase in soil organic matter when we're in permanent pasture. And this, while it's not surprising, is encouraging to see on actual farms. You know, we've measured these sorts of things in field experiments for many decades, but what we don't have as much information on is on-farm responses to long-term management. And that's what this study is really designed to do. And so when I was initially looking at the data, I was a little bit concerned that we might not see clear trends. And then what are we going to do with all this data? Because it's a lot of work. So seeing those trends is encouraging, but you'll also recognize that there's a lot of variability. And that's not surprising in a study of this nature. We saw similar trends in soil respiration. So a small step up by simply adding manure to cash grain operations, a subsequently larger bump up in median respiration rates when you added in the perennials. So these are, largely it's alfalfa or clovers that persist in that system for a longer period of time. And then an additional step up in our field class for our permanent hay and pasture fields. Permanganate oxidizable carbon or active carbon, POX-C. There's some of the different names for it. We didn't see as clear a result, but still see a bump up from adding that manure, and then a slight increase for enhancing perenniality in those systems, so more diversified rotations, and then roughly the same median, but a much bigger range of POX-C results when we bring in our fields that are in permanent pasture and hay. Soil protein, again, this is a measure of potentially mineralizable nitrogen. So it's protein that's in the soil that potentially can be broken down and then released on a gradual basis to our crops or plants. And again, not as much of a difference in soil protein between cash grain with no manure and with manure. Kind of expected to see a little bit more of a bump there, but not quite as responsive. But we did see an increase when we extended the rotations and added manure. And then again, another step up in our perennial pastures and hay fields. And then finally, these soil enzymes, these may not be as familiar to some growers. They're not typical measures that you include on a soil test, but they are potentially sensitive to management, as we see here. And these soil enzymes essentially catalyze different reactions in the soil, related to organic matter breakdown and decomposition. So beta glucosidase activity is related to the breakdown of cellulose into glucose. And we see, not surprisingly, as we increase our organic matter from manure additions and then more extended rotations, we see subsequently higher levels of this enzyme to process that that cellulose. And so for those of you who like sight gags, this I think is illustrative of what type of material this enzyme is designed to break down, that cellulose material. And then finally, we also looked at aryl sulfatase activity, which helps to break down organic sulfur-containing molecules. And again, same type of trends. As we increase manure additions and perenniality, and then make our way to field class 4, higher levels of this enzyme as well. So on the biological side of things, if we kind of look at them all, 6 of those panels side by side, we see pretty consistent trends across all those different measures of biological health, which I was excited to see. There's no guarantee that you'll see these sorts of trends when you do a big study like this. So that was encouraging. And this is still a work in progress. We've got also an enormous amount of data related to management practices on individual farms. And that's going to be a really powerful opportunity to be able to do some multivariate analysis to understand, okay, well, what about different tillage practices among those farmers? Can we explain some of that variability, based on their tillage practice or their use of cover crops or the type of livestock manure that they're applying? So they store it in a wide range of different ways. We've got all that information in terms of storage system, dry matter content, and nutrient content. So stay tuned. There's going to be a lot more coming from this data set in years ahead. But just wanted to let you guys know that there is value in coming out, and there's people that are interested in coming out and ground truthing some of these soil health measures, on farm. And so I'm excited about working on this. I've learned a lot already and look forward to our continued work here. Key findings: manure in general led to a modest bump in many of those soil health parameters, but the bigger bump came from adding perennials to the rotation, particularly on the biological measures. We see these as a pretty robust data set across Eastern and Western Ohio. And overall, the results are consistent with the broad literature, which is encouraging and helps to highlight how the potential impacts that different management practices have when implemented on the farm. And that said, every field and every farm is different. And so, not surprisingly, we had a lot of variability among those farms, but the fact that we've got so many fields and so many farms involved gives us a fair bit of statistical power to be able to explain some of those results when we start to do more detailed statistical analysis. So with that, how much time do we have? We're good. All right. So with that, thank you very much for having me. If you have questions,